Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Reverend Kosho Finch.
So, we're on episode 14 now of True Words, a Shingon Buddhist podcast. And this time, the topic is going to be on a well rounded holistic practice.
Yeah, so we've been talking about different practices in Shingon and Buddhism in general. And some recent conversation has raised the question of, what should practice look like? Because these days, when people think about Buddhist practice, I think most people tell me they think about silent sitting meditation, or they're thinking about mindfulness practice. So, although mindfulness is part of the Buddhist tradition, it's sort of been taken out and amplified, and a lot of other important practices, concepts, ideas are missing from that movement. So, we thought maybe we'd start with, what does practice look like? What things should be in a practice so that it's more well-rounded.
Yeah, so what do you think comprises a holistic Buddhist practice?
Well, I guess I'll talk about it from the perspective of me figuring out what that practice looked like for myself. So when I first started to study Buddhism, I was reading, practicing on my own. I didn't have a teacher or any specific instruction. So my assumption was, probably like most other people, especially in the United States or North America, that Buddhist practice was just silent sitting. And then when I got to college, I encountered a variety of other Buddhist groups and specific practices, and realized that silent sitting was the least of what I did. And when I tell people that, they're usually pretty surprised. So the first group I practiced with was a Taiwanese Buddhist group. So we did a lot of chanting the Buddha's name, other chanting practice, and listening to Dharma talks. So there was, of course, lecture and study. And then one of my first formal teachers was actually a Tibetan Lama in China. And so, we had prostration practice, making offerings. And that part was, I guess, not completely surprising to me, but going with my friends in China to the market, choosing the fruits and vegetables that would be offered, um, working together, it felt much more like a family. And having that experience was very refreshing, coming from the perspective of solo practice. And then, as part of that group of friends, we would also do short pilgrimages. So outside Beijing, there are several pretty famous, historically important temples, and we'd rent a minibus and go out to those temples, and you could engage in some of the very traditional practices of freeing captive animals, things like that I had never seen talked about or even performed in the United States. So there was a variety of different practices. So I found that all of the attendant practices really put my mind in a state of repose, where formal practice then was a lot easier. But one of the things I noticed, and kind of incredibly important when working with a kind of a formal group, I noticed the group, there was no competition. And I realized after a while that I kept thinking, what's so special about this group? Why are these people, so nice, or why do I feel so comfortable around them? And there wasn't competition. There wasn't, no one was competing over who had a fancy watch, or who had the nicest car, or, well, at that time, who had a nice bicycle, mainland China. And there was no conversation about things like that. The conversation was all about, how did you feel? How are you really doing today? It wasn't one of those, how are you doing? And I say, okay, and they leave it at that. They would, really inquire how my studies at the university were going, who my teachers were, what kind of things I was studying, the size and length of my textbook. There seemed to be a genuine interest, and I found that that actually, I think, grew out of their practice. and it carried over into kind of the formal group setting. So, just it may seem strange to listeners, but just taking a deep interest in the needs of others is a practice. And having that sort of concern projected towards you can do a tremendous amount for your spiritual practice, your meditation practice, your overall development in the spiritual path, especially within Buddhism. So I found that was very helpful. From there was learning formal practices. So starting off in the Chinese and Tibetan traditions, of course I had to be taught how to pronounce the mantras or how to chant the Buddhist name in Chinese or in Tibetan. So there was that sort of remedial instruction initially, but then engaging in it often. And I found that part of my initial education was just seeing the seriousness with which people took their practice and the amount of time they spent doing it. So I think in the beginning, there was a lot of learning by osmosis, just being engaged, surrounded by it, seeing the way that people tended the altars in their home or in the practice space was just very amazing. And that wasn't a perspective that I could have ever gotten out of a book. So I think some of those sort of basic day-to-day activities in Buddhist communities was something that was very encouraging and helpful. So how about for yourself? Did you have any surprises maybe when you went to different Buddhist temples or between different Buddhist traditions? Like, I haven't seen that done before, or maybe, it seems like, or what my surprise was, oh, everyone does that.
So for me, when I started getting into Buddhism, I was under the impression that, Buddhism is essentially all chanting. And that's really because that's all I had seen. Later on, I was like, oh, wait, yeah, I guess meditation is a really big part of it too, huh? Yeah. So I guess that's a bit reverse from what most people see in the United States. But then when I actually started working at various monasteries and going to retreats, I learned that practice wasn't limited to just practice in the meditation hall or in the shrines, because there was one time I was in a lecture and the instructor said, you can do your 2 hours of traditional chanting in the morning and at night, but then you still have 20 other hours in the day. What are you doing in those 20 hours? So it really led me to understand that practice is something that we have to do 24/7. At all parts of our lives, there's something that we can do to be practicing, even if it's not in the shrine, even if it's not on a meditation cushion. It's what we're doing outside of that really matters in how we conduct ourselves, how we treat others, what thoughts we're thinking, and what we're saying to other people.
Yeah, I would agree. One of my friends in China ran a Buddhist supply shop, so they sold statuary and incense and things like this. And the care with which they wrapped things and took care of things, the way they took things off the shelf and showed it to potential buyers, I always noticed that there was a certain grace about that. It was completely different from any other, although there had to be in this exchange of money to keep the shop open. It was conducted in a completely different way, and I realized that for the owner, that was part of her spiritual practice. So it was not just selling a statue. There were books and things. If you bought something, you'd get probably 2 more bags of free things that went along with the statuary or something like that. So there was a lot that went into it. I took a group of people to Japan 2 years ago, and one of my friends who came with me, he noticed that as well. He said, wow, when we go to the temple, we always get tea or, someone brings us candy or chocolate. He said, but they don't just bring it and leave it. He said, I feel like everybody really cares about me or really was interested in my well-being. And I think that's sort of the sense of practicing all the time, not just seeing that practice is something you do on a cushion or, when you're bowing or when you're chanting. So trying to give some idea of how you're going to take it away and apply it in life. was going to be really important. So.
Yeah, and so some of the practices that I saw, similar to what you were saying about taking a lot of care in preparing things for someone. A lot of what I saw was cooking, which I'm still not very good at. um, but when I saw the nuns cook in the monastery, the care and how they really paid attention to the needs of the community, thinking, oh, well, I can't cook this because so and so has an allergy, and really making sure that their ingredients were fresh, that everything was being put to good use and nothing was being wasted. I thought, wow, this is completely a practice on its own. And then for me, one of the jobs that I was assigned to was scrubbing the bathrooms every week. So
it's a good job.
that was a very good job and a very helpful experience in showing me what my aversions were. And I think definitely in that I realized that, things like this, even though they might not be very glamorous jobs, are jobs that the temple needs. Someone has to keep it clean. And I might as well be the one who makes it as clean as I possibly can.
I think that's a good observation, but as I think we mentioned last time, it's not going to sell any good books if that's your title, Scrubbing Toilets, Learning Your Aversions. So, but I think that's, especially outside Asia or Asian communities, that type of idea or practice isn't presented very often, is not talked about, but is very important to the overall practice. When I was younger, I really didn't like washing dishes, so of course my job at the temple was washing dishes. In our
Funny
temple,
how things turn out.
of course, always. And of course, the temple in California did a lot of fundraisers, pancake breakfast and udon noodle sale. So there was, bringing in the community. There was always a lot of people coming to eat, and the dishes were piling up. So washing all of them, keeping up with the demand, was not just a job. It was actually taking care of people. So I realized at some point it transformed from something I didn't like to do into something I took a lot of joy in doing, because I really saw it as a service to others. So and those are, I think, ideas in Buddhist practice that are built in to why we do these things, that the ideas that we'll see those lessons and learn from doing menial work, or what we might think is menial work, or these kind of things around the temple. And now I find that cleaning the floor or cleaning things in the temple is actually just as much a part of practice as the formal practice. One of the temples in Hawaii is quite large, and there's a lot of things to be polished and nooks and crannies to be cleaned. And I remember a few years ago, we spent all day Christmas Day cleaning the temple in advance for New Year's. And some people came and they said, "Oh, why didn't you go somewhere and open gifts?" And we said, "Well, one, we're Buddhists, so it's just another day." But we said, it was actually very helpful for practice when we actually did the New Year service. It felt different. Everyone noticed the care with which the cleaning was done had a measurable effect on visitors to the temple. So practice itself isn't just on the cushion. It is something that we do everywhere. But we have to think about that and try to extend our practice away from just the meditation space.
Definitely, because I think for a lot of these, work can be just work, but at the same time, with the right perspective and with the right understanding, work can also be a very good form of practice. And I think a lot of times when I first started helping out at the temple, I saw work as work, and it wasn't very helpful. It was often actually very frustrating. But then after working through that and realizing where the aspects of practice showed up within the work, it was a lot more fulfilling.
I would agree. I worked at a company a long time ago. I won't say how many years. And when I first went to work at the company, it was maybe 130, 150 employees. And the owner came to me and he said, I don't want you to think of this as work for a particular amount of profit. He says, I want you to think of, your section brings in enough money to support 30 families. He said, so always think about, what you're doing supporting families here. He said, that's how we operate. And I thought that was it was a very Buddhist view of the company, even though it wasn't a Buddhist company. But in that respect, I found that my work was fulfilling, even when maybe outwardly it wasn't fulfilling. There were some times when it may have been kind of a grind or a lot of repetition, but if you had in mind that we were a goal and we weren't working for some kind of just number to increase, but actually work to support families, there was meaning. So I think in general, one of the things I've noticed in Buddhist practice, my practice also, is that you can bring meaning to everything you do. And if you find that kind of meaning, then you do a better job and you're happier, you're more fulfilled. So a lot of the, why do people come to spiritual practice? Why do they do things? Sometimes they say people tell me they want to meditate because they want to find happiness, or they want to find the secret to happiness. And I think it's something more that we create rather than the practice through some kind of magical ability of its own gives us. I think it's more something that it gives us the space to realize, and then we begin to take more meaning and understanding through Buddhist practice.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of practices overall, of course, there's a variety of practices within the Buddhist tradition. So we're often, sadly, left with just silent sitting as a meditation practice. But of course, as you mentioned, there's chanting, and there's of course a variety of different types of meditation. So there's breath meditation, there's meditation observing a particular object. I think just before we started this, I was mentioning to you the Shrangama Sutra mentions Avalokiteshvara's practice of listening to the sound of water as a meditation practice. So that's something that is very relaxing, and actually is, in a way, very unique that it gets us out of the temple, actually. You find some place where water's flowing and use that to listen. So meditation isn't something that we only do in the temple or sort of wearing robes or while the incense is burning. It can be something that we take with us on the road.
Possibly on a hike.
Yes, no, yeah, especially on a hike, yeah. Pacific Northwest is good for that.
Yeah. And I think in addition to those practices, one that's very helpful for me, in moderation at least, is studying and reading. Perhaps it's because I'm still in student mode, but building that sort of familiarity with the text and having that foundation for the practice to build on is really helpful.
I would agree. I think in the beginning I read a lot of Buddhist texts and maybe didn't quite understand how they were connected. In fact, you just sort of jump in with whatever book was available and read it. But over time, combining that practice and study became very helpful. And through my practice, I got a lot more insight into the text. Even sometimes said, oh, now I actually have that experience. Usually the experiences of what not to do. But that can be very helpful. So I would agree the study portion is very good. And I think something obviously that we emphasize here at the temple, but something I think doesn't often get as much emphasis as it should in North America. I don't see a lot of people talking about Buddhist practice and discussing what sutra they read the night before. They may be more focused on, the question I get most often is, well, how many hours do you meditate per day or something along this line? And, explaining that that's less important than maybe, even 5 minutes of quality meditation or half an hour of, quality reading material would be something that better serves people's practice than sort of staying in a meditative state for, prolonged periods.
And then on the other side as well, reading all about Buddhism is not going to make you a very accomplished meditator or practitioner either. So there has to be sort of a balance of both aspects.
That's true. You can't be just the armchair Buddhist. So there's a lot of popular books about Buddhism which are very good, but we can't leave our practice just to that or say, well, I read something and I kind of agree with the premise, so I'll call myself a Buddhist. that won't affect much change in us. So there has to be the practice as well. And on the topic of practice, so we mentioned, of course, that there is more than just silent sitting. So there's a variety of different meditations. So, for example, the practice of the four immeasurables, where you're actually generating particular states of mind. And this is probably one that would be of interest to a lot of people, especially those who say they're interested in finding happiness. Of course, one of the practices there is the practice of joy and learning to share in the joy of others. So usually when I talk about this particular meditation, I say, in fact, these days when we see people happy, we're very quick, I think especially maybe it's gotten worse with social media, to ask, well, why is that person so happy? Or why do they deserve to be happy and not me? So instead of just being happy that other people are happy, we have other emotions that come up. So this practice of immeasurable joy actually helps to train us to take joy in other people's joy, and then wish that other people have the causes and conditions for joy in their life. And that can be a very powerful and transformative practice. And then just seeing how far you can extend it out. Eventually you'll find that maybe there's somebody that you think, I don't want to share my joy with them. So then we go back to the text to study and say, okay, well, why might we have that emotion? Is there an antidote to that emotion? What practice could I do to help work on that emotion? And so I think what I've found over the years is there's a back and forth. So you do a particular practice, you may find that at some point you become proficient in that practice, but then you find an obstacle. So then you search the text or you talk to a teacher about, well, how can I actually get over this obstacle? Maybe there's a different practice or a slightly different perspective on that practice, or there's what I would say more of an illumination of that practice, and then go back to doing the practice with that new understanding. So there's definitely this back and forth that has to happen in Buddhist practice, where you get off the cushion and we sit at the desk and read, and then we get away from the desk and we maybe go to the kitchen or bathroom and scrub something, and then out on the hiking trail and enjoy nature, and then come back. So I think all of those things are important. There can't be just one point of entry, one single practice that's going to somehow sustain our practice completely.
And like you said in the previous episode, some practice is better than no practice. So I know when I was first starting in Buddhism, I wasn't sure what practice to start off with. Should I do chanting? Should I do meditation? If I do chanting, what should I chant? And there was a lot of confusion about this. And eventually I just decided, well, I'm just going to go with whatever I have. So whatever books were available at the local temple, I took one home. It happened to be chapter 25 of the Lotus Sutra on Kanon Bodhisattva. So I did that for a very long time, and then after a while, other Buddhist books started appearing, and then my practice just grew and grew and grew. But then I realized that if I had tried just jumping into this pile of text at the beginning, a lot of it probably wouldn't have made sense. So it was very good for me in that I started with one relatively short practice. I would say it takes about 15-20 minutes at the beginning to chant that text, but then slowly building and growing the practice.
I would agree. I think so. Chanting wasn't something that I encountered actually through reading initially. It was something that was probably one of the first things I was taught when I came to a more formal practice. And in the beginning, it was definitely surprising that this was the practice I was given. I thought that Buddhism was all about meditation. Why am I being told to chant? And then I found actually that in many ways it was easier. So I won't say their name, of course, but I think they'll be listening. I got a call recently from someone who a year ago had told me, well, Buddhism is really hard because there's all this chanting. And they didn't necessarily see the benefit. They didn't understand what they were chanting. They didn't necessarily see how they could benefit from reciting something that they didn't understand, speaking of chanting in Japanese. And then their mother had gotten to the point where there was a kind of early onset dementia. And they said that, well, the only time that the mother is 100% clear and completely, focused is when they're chanting. That was the one thing that they hadn't forgotten, because they've been doing it their whole life. So this person said, well, being inspired by seeing their mother, who was starting to suffer this dementia, began to chant again, and they found that actually, where they didn't have much luck in meditation, they found actually the chanting brought them a lot of peace, and was meditative. And so they said, well, now they didn't think it was hard anymore. They actually felt that it was a really beneficial practice. So I think one of the hard things about meditation in general, or any kind of spiritual practice, is it's sometimes hard to do. It's sometimes hard to get into a space where we're calm. And one of the benefits of any kind of chanting practice is it sort of builds that space for us. So it's something that we bring our voice to, even if it's not that loud, even if we're not that fluent or expert in the chanting, but we can use it as a way to gauge our practice. Are we stumbling over the words? Are we getting frustrated? Or does it start to become a little bit easier for us? But even if we're in a difficult situation, sometimes that is a practice that we can come back to, and it's something that can be very beneficial. And I'm glad you mentioned actually earlier the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra. I was thinking about it the other day. I was reading it and I thought, well, for especially somebody who was not raised Buddhist, sometimes what I hear is they are confused by that chapter, and seeing a lot of what they consider to be supernatural occurrences. And so I was
can
thinking,
see that.
yeah, right? If you maybe haven't had it explained or anything. So I was thinking, well, how would I explain, why this should be chanted, or what could your takeaway be from it, just as a first-time reader. And sometimes I say for reading Buddhist sutras, you have to be a little bit of reading between the lines. And so, however you want to take what's written, one, I think, easy takeaway can be, what's the motivation of Avalokiteshvara in this text? And what you see is a lot of responding to the needs of others, really understanding what people's needs are, and really saying that no matter what, she's going to be there for that person, and asking, how can we have that same motivation? Who in our lives needs help, and how can we help them, and how are they best served? Not in a way that's convenient for us, but in a way that's most helpful to them. And I think if you just approach the text maybe initially that way, it's not so fanciful, or not so terse, or so easily misunderstood. So a lot of Buddha sutras, sometimes we have to ask ourselves, why is this information being presented? What's the overall motivation behind the words? And come back later to the imagery that's used in it, because most often there's a lot of highly symbolic language, but taking it completely literally at the beginning can sometimes be confusing. I can definitely see that. The first time I read it, I was thinking, this isn't what I expected. Other practices that people can do, of course, there's a variety of different types of meditation. So I mentioned the four immeasurables. And of course in Shingon there's a lot of visualization. So one of the basic practices for visualization is the Mundus meditation, Gachirinkan. And in that practice, so of course we teach that here in Portland, the temple in Seattle does as well. You actually visualize the full moon, and it's a kind of the literal image of the full moon, but it's sort of a stand-in for the clear nature of your mind and your consciousness. And on the outside, it seems very simple. It's just a white circle. But in actuality, the practice can be a little bit difficult. But one of the benefits of it is, instead of thinking of nothing, you can think of something. And it's a little bit easier to work with a visualization. Can you actually hold that image in the mind? Can you expand it? Can you hold the expansion? Is it steady? Does it move around? Do you find that it's sort of jumping around the page of your mind? You can get an idea of what your meditation is actually like. So visualization can be a practice that some people find easier, or not visualizing, of course, silent sitting meditation, or chanting practice where you're actually bringing a meditative state through the use of the voice. So there's a variety of practices. So I would encourage listeners to not, maybe if the first book you picked up or the first Buddhist center you went to is teaching a particular meditation and you've practiced it for a while, and you might want to try something else, I would say don't give up on that initial practice. Maybe seek out a second practice, test it for a while, but most importantly, do some sort of practice. So any practice is better than no practice. So do you have any other recommendations for beginning people on the path, or even, I can say this now, young people coming to Buddhism?
Yeah, young people coming to Buddhism. So I think a lot of this is, especially in this day and age, it's very busy, and I think there's a lot of cases when people just don't feel like they have any time for practice. So really what was helpful for me when I was starting was finding those pockets of time when I could meditate, and that oftentimes when I was walking to class I would have a few minutes of just breathing meditation, counting the breath while I'm walking, or reciting a mantra as I'm walking, and really finding those little pockets where I could be staring down at my phone while walking to class and checking my Facebook.
That sounds dangerous.
I think it is. Yeah, I would be able to be more focused in what I was doing and make that time for myself. Or, I mean, really, other times included meals. If I was eating alone, I could be eating and staring at my phone the entire time. Or I could take it as sort of like a formal meal in the monastery and really pay attention to the food, be grateful and appreciative of the food, and turn that 10, maybe 15 minutes of a quick meal in the dining hall into a practice.
So I guess I'll leave our listeners with a homework assignment, and that'll be, since we talked about technology, is put your phone down, put your devices down, turn the TV off, the radio off, for maybe, let's see, half hour before you go to sleep, right? The difficult time. So I hear from almost everyone that they have trouble sleeping and they toss and turn. It's hard to go to sleep. So, disconnecting, especially in that time before sleep comes, can be very helpful. And see if we can do a little bit of meditation during that time, even 5 minutes. But create a miniature retreat for yourself by just turning the devices off. Of course, if you need it for an alarm clock in the morning, or there's some emergency call, you don't have to completely turn it off, but at least put it down, or don't look at the screen. Turn your mind off from it. That can be incredibly helpful. So these days, I think when I was younger and we would complain that we were bored, I think now there's always some stimulus available for people. So maybe we'll try a little bit of boredom, and that can be very helpful, actually, both for developing, maintaining, creating a meditative state, but also just for maybe what these days we call sleep hygiene, helping us get better rest. So for all our listeners, the podcast is over, but also disconnect from your other devices.
All right. Thank you, Sensei.
Thank you.